Hello again, and welcome to Lesson 14 in our class on evangelistic strategies. In this lesson, we're going to switch gears from talking about how you as an individual share the gospel or how you can train others to share the gospel. In this lesson, we're going to discuss two specific strategies. One is to bring a short-term team to your location, and this can be done whether you are in the USA or in another nation. The team might come from the USA or from your own nation or a different nation. The second will be to hold an evangelistic event or campaign. These do not work very well in the U.S. unless you have some kind of celebrity pastor, and they may or may not be suitable for your location depending on how open your culture is to this kind of event. Still, in the last 100 years, more people have come to Christ in evangelistic campaign, big events, than in any other particular strategy that we know of. Names like Billy Graham and Reinhard Bonnke and Greg Laurie come to mind as really global evangelists. The term, when we talk about short-term missions and long-term missions, the term missionary is curious. It did not come into the English language directly from the New Testament, from the Greek, but rather from Latin. And it was after the Roman Catholic Church employed the term in a Christian context. When we talk about who is a missionary, the Latin word missio simply means one sent by another. One sent by another. It might be a religious thing or not. In the Greek language, apostello is the word, one sent out on my behalf, at my request, under my commission, for my purpose. So it's a very close translation. We know what an apostle is in the Greek. We say an apostle is one who was in the first 12, the very first trained disciples of Jesus who were with him day and night. And the term apostle also meant a person of great leadership and who was dedicated to the expansion of the church. So now we have missionaries around the world who oftentimes are leaders and expanders of the church, even though they don't have the power of those first 12. The ones today were not eyewitnesses to the resurrection. They don't have that extraordinary authority. But in the New Testament, the term was applied to other people beside the 12. The term apostle or missionary was applied to Paul, for example. Also in the book of Acts, it says, Andronicus and Junius were numbered among the apostles. So apparently the term apostle is broader than the original 12. I like to differentiate and call the 12 and apostles apostles. And I believe we have today many people who are doing missionary work in an apostolic sense. We see all kinds of other people going out on mission trips in the book of Acts. Notably Silas and Luke and Mark and Demas. Let me say this. You, my brother, you, my sister, you may have an apostolic calling upon your life. God may have commissioned you to go out into the world and share the gospel, even if you never go more than 1 kilometer from your house. The key here is not distance, but purpose. And I want to remind you once again that the Great Commission of Jesus found in the book of Matthew that says, "Go you into all the world and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, and teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I taught you." That Great Commission, the emphasis is not placed upon the going. We don't accomplish anything by just going. We accomplish by making disciples, okay? That is the key activity for all people who are apostolic, all people who are missionaries. I believe you can see that one more time here. As you are going, make disciples. The imperative is not to go. The imperative is to make disciples. I've repeated that a few times, and I've done that intentionally so that you would make sure that you do understand that. For this lesson, I'm going to talk about short-term mission teams in terms of people that come to help you. Or you may be the short-term missionary who goes from wherever you live to help another group of believers in another place. And yes, short-term missions is now accomplished not only by people in highly developed and prosperous nations, but by people everywhere. Many agencies like YWAM, Youth with a Mission, or the International Commission, a mostly Baptist group that I worked for myself for years. We regularly sent people from all kinds of places into neighboring nations or other regions in their own country. So I mention this to open your mind to the idea that you might both receive a team to help you, and you might also go as a team to help others. Let's talk about short-term teams. About 95% of all the Christian workers on the planet live and work in one place, just like you do, where they live. Only about 200,000 people can say, I've left my home country and I serve in another nation for years and years and decades, and that's kind of our definition of a long-term missionary. Perhaps you've known some people that came to your country for the very long term. But short-term missionaries, more than 1 million people annually, including you, might leave your home and travel for a few days or a week or two or a month and do some things. And these short-term teams have their advantages and their disadvantages. When the short-term trips, as they're called, are well planned and well executed, a short-term team can bring real benefit to your host church and also return home being mightily blessed and changed forever. These advantages, the advantages of a short-term team, they should provide help to the host church. If they come to accomplish something, they should be able to accomplish it. It also expands the team's horizon. I worked for an agency, and I've led 30 to 40 of these short-term trips. The people who go on the trip come back, and they have a much greater awareness of what's going on in the world. Their horizon, their understanding of the world is much broader. And it even raises awareness of the senders, the people who gave money and prayed and supported their friends who went across the world. Yes, when the team is effective, when the work is effective, all kinds of good things happen. They'll make new friends at the host church. The host church will learn that they have friends that have come to visit them. The hosts learn that there's others out there who care for them, who know that they're there, who pray for them, who cheer for them. And they're reminded that their church, even though it might be a small church in a small country far away, is actually a part of a very large family of churches, and we're all in this together. But there is one factor that characterizes all successful short-term trips, and this should be your goal, whether you are the host or you are the team going or the sender. And we call this the bottom line. In other words, when all the good and bad is mixed together, the bottom line would be this. The host local believers are encouraged by the presence of the short-term team that was with them. If that happens, you've had a successful short-term trip that will have a long-term impact, because when the local believers are encouraged, they will continue the work long after the team has gone home. On the negative side, all kinds of things can go wrong. Here are some potential problems that can result in a short-term trip. One is it can become a very inconvenient thing for the host church. No short-term trip should cause problems, stresses, or inconveniences to the church that they came to help. A second reason here is that helping can actually hurt sometimes. Sometimes you can go and do things that the host church could have well done on their own, and you're coming and doing those things doesn't help. A dependency can be created where the church decides we can no longer do evangelistic events unless we have a team come and help us do them. And that's not true. Sometimes you can have a team come and help you. Sometimes you can do things without a team coming to help you. You don't want dependency. And in rare cases, we have seen the short-term team come and behave in such a way or cause conflicts that they left a bad name in the community. And I pray that never happens to you, either as a host or as a team member. So let's talk about how to plan and carry out a short-term project with excellence so that the advantages are realized and the problems are avoided. Step number one. Step one is to plan very far ahead. Most teams are going to come for only 7 to 10 days. There's some reasons for that, but they're going to need 6 to 12 months to plan that trip. A year is not too early to begin planning to have a short-term team come and help you. For one thing, the team has to raise their own funds. They also have to make arrangements to be gone from their jobs for a time. In fact, one of the reasons that these trips usually last this length of time is most people who have a job can take a leave from that job, or called a vacation from that job, for 2 weeks. That's the longest they can be gone without losing their job. So most short-term trips that I've ever been a part of typically involve traveling for a day or two, arriving at the host country, arriving at the host church, getting acquainted, about 1 good week, about 7 days of work, and then maybe a day of celebrating everything, and then coming home from the trip. Factors for selecting the date of this trip would include, what is the weather and climate? Let me emphasize this. Only the host leaders are going to know these things. A short-term team coming from Europe or coming from Korea or coming from the USA, they're not going to know those things. What about your school schedule? Are you aware that school schedules vary greatly from nation to nation? In some nations, schools start in January and end in December. They go year-round. Other nations, schools start in September and run until the next spring, and they're off in the summertime. In some countries in South America, summertime is in January, and that's when school is out. And so these factors should be brought into consideration. And then thirdly, what about cultural holidays or events? You, as a host, you will know when these things are taking place. When there are certain cultural celebrations, you might be able to tie into these celebrations and during this time do ministry. I'll give you an example of that. When the Olympics, Summer Olympics or Winter Olympics have been held, short-term teams often show up as Christians and do service projects during the Olympic Games and are able to make a very positive witness through service evangelism during the very time. On the other hand, certain kinds of events, you would not want to hold those in a city at the very time they were hosting the Olympics, because everyone's going to be distracted with those Olympics. The key thought here is this: don't expect a visiting team to understand the host church's culture and know what would be a good time or not a good time. And if you're a host, please don't take the attitude of, well, we don't know when to tell them to come. We'll just let them come whenever they want to come. That's not a good plan. Really, the hosts know the most about these things. I'll stop a minute and tell you a story. In 1979, I was on a evangelistic trip. About 50 people left the United States to go down to Nicaragua. And we landed there between two periods of war, of civil war, between the troops of Somoza and the troops of the Sandinistas. The amazing thing was we were watching the news on television, and it did not seem to us that it was really safe to go. But the leaders of the host nation did not tell us, we don't think you should come. It's too dangerous. Let's reschedule for another time. They simply had given us these dates, and they were standing by these dates. They said, we're ready for you to come. If you want to come, we're ready for you to come. The American teams were watching the news on television, and it did not look safe, but we said, the hosts apparently think it's safe. So we got on the plane and we went to Nicaragua. And it was dangerous. We had a great time. Wonderful things happened. No one got hurt, but it was a dangerous time. And while we were there, our leader said to the host leader, it's really pretty dangerous. We're surprised that you did not tell us to reschedule. And the host's answer was, we don't get very good news coverage in our own country. We know that you are getting better news coverage on the American television networks. And so we felt if you felt it was safe enough, we were not going to tell you not to come. So it was a good laugh. Each side thought the other side would know more. When I'm telling you, I think the host country, the host of a short-term team should always be in charge, be the leaders. The team that's coming is coming to serve. When I would take a team, I would always say, we are not coming to do your work for you. We're not coming to tell you how to do your work. We're coming to work alongside you and partner with you. So that's the planning. hosts plan best. Then step 2 is to set the purpose for the trip. Now, a short-term team can come and do many things. I've been a part of teams that have done all these things: medical training, construction work, children's ministry. Most people who come to Jesus around the planet, are you aware of this? Most people who come to faith in Jesus over the last 2,000 years came as children, not as adults. I'm one of those who came as an adult. But remember, Jesus even said, "Let the little children come to me, for such is the kingdom of heaven." He never said children must grow up and be like adults to understand the kingdom of God. No, adults must be childlike and be like children to understand the kingdom of God. You can do children's ministry. You can do pastoral training. I think with the internet, we're now able to do wonderful pastoral training online through this Lucent Institute. But in the past, I have traveled overseas and led seminars, but you can't stay long enough to do as much teaching as we're doing here. And you can greatly do evangelism. There's something happens special when people come from far away to give a message. I know in many of my experiences in South America, the ordinary person, perhaps in a small country, had never seen or met an American visitor. They might have seen them on a bus of tourists, but they'd never had them in their home. And so we would land and be guests of a local church, and they would take us out every day to witness to their friends and neighbors alongside them. We would be the first Americans ever to walk into a home, and this gave us an open door. We would laugh and joke about the fact that the local church was really doing the evangelism. They were fishing for men, and they were using the short-term team from America, North America, as bait. Okay, we were the bait to catch the fish. So a team can do all these things, but these purposes must be determined by the host church as useful things to do. The host leaders must be the real leaders of the project. The team that comes is not in charge. They come to serve. Now, here's what the team believes. We will say this to people. We don't come to tell you how to do ministry. And we don't come to do the ministry all for you. We just came to work alongside you and work with you in the plans that you have made, in the hopes that you have, and you know the methodologies that will work here. The worst thing I ever heard when I was leading short-term teams all over the world was we would land on the airplane, we would take a bus, maybe to the hotel and clean up and sleep, and then we would take another bus the next day out to the towns and villages where the churches were, and the leaders and the members would be all assembled together, and they would greet us, and they would welcome us, and everybody was in place, and the host leader would say to me, "Okay, now you're here. What was it that you wanted to do?" Oh, please, the project goes much better when everything is planned in advance. And this is true even in cultures who normally do not worry a lot about the long-term future. If you want a visiting team to come to your location and be helpful, every detail of the project must be ready in advance. The team is only going to be able to be with you for a week or 10 days, maybe sometimes 3 or 4 weeks, but not a long time. If they're coming to do construction and they arrive and the materials are not there, it's a serious setback. In fact, just this year, a team that I was involved in traveled to the Philippine Islands for the purpose of drilling a water well at a church. And we arrived there only to discover some of the materials were not there that we thought would be there. And so the team lost 2 whole days going back into the capital city, searching and buying these parts and bringing them out into the country. And so as a consequence, they were only able to drill 2 wells instead of 3. It cost us a whole well, and it cost us the ability to train the people to drill the wells because the materials were simply not there. So what kind of details are we going to plan in advance? Well, what are the project's goals? What is it that we want to accomplish? Again, the host church should be in charge of determining that, but they must communicate that clearly in advance. Will we need materials? What kind of materials are involved? If we're doing evangelism, we know that they're going to need publicity, and publicity is always more work than we think it is. And telling the community about what we're going to do is a key thing. Can we make a budget? And we talk about money for the trip. The short-term team will usually have a plan to pay every single expense of their accommodations, their transportation, and their food, all costs associated. I cannot speak for every team that you might recruit, but if you communicate clearly as part of the goals that the team wants to come and help and complete the project, they must cover all the costs so that the host church is not left with debts to pay or had to take money that we're going to use for other purposes to pay for the team. I'm telling you, almost every short-term team I know of wants to pay all their costs, but they must know in advance of the trip what those costs are. Believe it or not, most of the people coming on a short-term trip are not wealthy people who have unlimited amounts of money. They need to have a budget. If the host church can contribute to some of the costs, such as materials or publicity, that's an excellent thing to do. But the key here is very simple, and that is this. The visiting team will be happy to pay for any expense that they were informed of in advance, expenses that were communicated to them in the advance plan. I say this because sometimes I have been a part of short-term teams that showed up somewhere and discovered there were costs that no one had told us about, and we did not bring the money for those costs, and we had to make kind of emergency arrangements to locate money, to borrow money, and do those things. In a perfect world, one of the solutions that will make your plan very good, excellent, better, is to have the leader of the short-term trip, not the whole team, just the leader, to come and make an advanced planning trip before the group comes. If the leader can come and meet the people, they can specify every single detail of the project and put those things in writing. When you are communicating with a short-term team long distance before they come, I want to encourage you to use email rather than a telephone call. The problem with the telephone call is you can say one thing and they will hear a different thing, whereas an email is always in writing, even if it has to be translated from one language to the other, and both sides are have more potential to have good, accurate communication. Telephone calls are the worst way to communicate something and believe that you have communicated it. You say one thing, they heard something entirely different, and nobody has a written record of that anywhere. Now, part of the planning for a short-term team involves accommodations. The teams need to get rest at night. They need to feel safe. They need to stay well. This may be one of the most sensitive elements of planning. Where do we house the teams? How do they get fed? How do we keep them well? It's going to vary in all kinds of conditions. I have been on short-term trips where I stayed in homes. I've been in short-term trips where I stayed in small hotels. I've been in short-term trips where there were no small hotels and we stayed in expensive hotels. I've been there. Sometimes if the short-term team are younger students, they can camp out in a tent. They can sleep on the ground. I've slept on the ground many times. If they're older adults are not so adaptable. They're going to do better in a hotel room, and they're willing to pay for the hotel room. Honestly, I have run the whole spectrum. I've stayed in nice hotels, bad hotels, nice homes, primitive homes. I've slept on the ground for a tent, and I slept one time with no tent. A team can do almost anything if it knows about it in advance, and they will come prepared. Let me say this. Normally, I believe teams do better if they stay in a hotel. If they stay in the homes of believers, a lot of great fellowship takes place. But the host believers may end up missing a lot of the events of the project because so much of their time is taken up being an innkeeper and being a host in the home and cooking and cleaning in the homes. If the team stays in a hotel, the hotel workers can take care of the food and the lodging of the team, and the host church members are able to focus more on being a part of the event and the project and not having to be a host. You'll have to decide for yourself. More and more, I am seeing teams stay in homes, and it works pretty well. But please remember this. If teams come from America, they do not want to be treated as very special people. They do not want to be treated like dignitaries. Honestly, they don't want big meals every day like banquets or feasts. Believe it or not, these are regular people just like you, and what they really want to do is be able to invest themselves in the project, teach the children, train the pastors, build the building, do the medical work, whatever. They've come to work alongside you. You do want to maybe show them around the local area to see the local sites, just like I would do. If you came to my town in Denver, Colorado, I would take you up in the mountains and show you our mountains and rivers and parks. Sure, but I might do that for half of a day, and then the rest of the week we're going to do the project, and then at the end of the week we might do a whole day of rest and relaxation somewhere. But people come to do the work, not to be treated as real dignitaries, okay? In terms of transportation, the teams usually easily can afford to pay for good transportation. That might be a rental bus, that might be a van or a taxi or a ferry boat. I think it's best not to put them on local city buses that are filled with people when they have their suitcases and their backpacks and all the gear they bring. For the transport from the airport to wherever they're staying, I would put them on a private bus so we don't lose some of that baggage. During the week, just traveling locally, sure, you can put them on rickshaws or jitneys or whatever, cable cars, trains, trams, trucks, and they will enjoy the experience of traveling the way the locals traveled. Will never forget being in India and traveling on very crowded roads with the cows and the elephants and motorcycles, and I found myself praying all the time in the backseat of the car the Lord's Prayer that I would make it, and my Indian host thought this was quite amusing, but I was genuinely quite anxious at traveling on roads in India. But by the grace of God, we did make it. They can also buy food in cafes, and they can pay for those foods. They can be fed by a host family. And here again, the host leader should direct the team if a reimbursement to the host family for feeding a team a whole week long is appropriate or not. Sometimes it's appropriate to reimburse people. Other times they don't want reimbursement. Sometimes you can eat meals in a church. And again, the team would probably be happy to contribute to the purchase of the groceries for the team and the hosts who are eating in the church. For sure, bottled water like this is a good thing. You see me drinking it all the time to keep my voice going. But bottled water is everywhere, and it will prevent a lot of potential problems for visitors. Please keep in mind that visitors do not have the biological resistance to germs that the hosts already have. The water can be fine for hosts to drink, but that same water will not be fine for visitors to drink. And I have been on short-term trips several times where I fell ill and lost a day or two of being able to do the projects because I had the stomach problems. It usually takes about a day or two to work that out. Okay, let's switch gears, part 2 of this lesson. Let's talk about doing some kind of campaign where a short-term team helps you not only with projects at your church, but a public evangelistic campaign, maybe like something Billy Graham would have conducted, but on a much smaller scale. If this sort of event is appropriate for your culture, let's consider some factors here, okay? Public events, I would never use the word crusade. I think that all Christians should banish the word crusade. Even Billy Graham's team used to call their meetings crusades, and they don't anymore. They call them campaign. The word campaign is a much safer word than crusade because that word is offensive to Muslim peoples and actually to all non-Christian peoples. It's an obsolete word. Campaign, rally, experience, these are much better words. Much prayer must precede the event. Oh, I cannot tell you the difference it makes. Months and months of prayer will make for a better event. Sometimes the greatest work we do of preparation is on our knees before an event. And then the last thing is, if it's an event involving the public, the most difficult thing to do is to bring the people to the meeting. And notice I didn't say just to invite the people to the meeting, just to tell them that we're having a meeting. No, we have to bring the people to the meeting. Not very many people who are not Christians are going to show up and come to a meeting on their own. Without prayer and planning, these events may become a disaster with almost no one attending except those who are already believers and those who are coming to work and do the work and support the event. Nothing is worse than renting a big gymnasium or auditorium, and then on the evening of the event, you end up singing and preaching to a whole building of empty seats. And this kind of failure usually comes as a result of assuming that the whole town will come because they heard about the event or they saw a poster or they saw it in the newspaper. No, your publicity efforts usually are not going to be effective unless you attract the people to come and your people invite the people and your people come to the event. When thinking about publicity, I'm telling you, it starts on your knees. There is an internal part to publicity. If you have a budget for doing some publicity, make it 2 times. Make it 2 times what you think you need. Make it 3 times what you need. Don't spend all of your money on buying expensive music equipment or setting up lights or sound equipment. Spend the money on publicity. The people who are coming need to be able to see and hear, but that's it. When I'm thinking about prayer, I remember that I mentioned to you before that it's important to go in before a holy God and talk about sinful people before we go out and set up a bunch of chairs and try to explain to sinful people about this holy God. Go in first to God, then come out to the people. Organize teams of people in your church to pray, from your church, from perhaps many churches. These big events work great if they're really well prepared, but if they're thrown together at the last minute, they often can be just disastrous and people are discouraged. One other way besides publicity to prepare is to enlist lots of workers to the campaign. You need these workers to do the work. Yes, you do. But the more people you enlist to participate, the more prayer will go up. The people will feel what we call an ownership. They will feel that they are part of the project, that this is not just the pastor's project, this is their project. When they feel it's their project, great things can happen and they will get more involved. So really, you want to enlist a whole organization of people. Building a short-term organization right there at home of teams, or you might call them committees. There could be a prayer committee. There could be a publicity committee. There could be a food committee, a follow-up committee, counselors. There could be ushers. There could be greeters. There could be workers to prepare the sound project, musicians. There could be additional people who are going to give testimonies. And the more people are involved in the project, the more that they will feel that this is their project and not your project. And that is really a key. Next, let's talk about who are you going to have on the platform guests. Do you want to have a preacher who comes a great distance? Sometimes that is an attraction, and sometimes we have people who are actually skilled and gifted at preaching to a congregation of people for whom they can't speak the language, but they're gifted at doing this. It can be a draw, even if the person is not a celebrity, but simply someone from another place. It is a curiosity, an interest thing. Translated sermons are usually not a problem. I have preached many sermons through an interpreter or translator to large groups of people who did not speak English, and I did not speak their language. Interestingly enough, the sermon has to be shorter because of the translation time, and that's usually a good thing. I've also found when preaching sermons through translators that if I say something funny, a good number of the people will laugh before the translator translates the funny story. And this clues me in that a good number of people are actually hearing the sermon twice, once in my language and once in their language. And that's something like many of you are watching and listening to me in English and seeing the subtitles on the screen. That reinforces the teaching. So I do think you don't have to shy away from having an international preacher who speaks in one language. He might come from Korea and preach in Korean, and then someone translates that language into Spanish or Portuguese. This can be a real asset and not a liability. For sure, you do want people who have experience and are trained and skilled at speaking in a large venue. There are different things about large venues. Most of these meetings have guest musicians, but I love it when the host people are also providing music. So some of the music is by the guests, some of the music is by the hosts. The church I was pastor of in Colorado at one time had our choir travel to the nation of Latvia, and our choir went around singing in English. And the local choir actually joined with our choir, and they had learned to sing in English, and our people had learned to sing in Latvian. They didn't know what they were saying, but they had learned some of the words. And we ended up with a joint choir singing in both languages, and this was quite interesting and was a very successful program, and great things happened out of that. There is a different skill set for speaking to a house church than speaking on a large outdoor stage. Some pastors understand this, others do not. If you're in a very small group, you can dialogue with an audience. You can ask questions. In your sermon, you can say, what do you think Paul meant by this expression here? And maybe someone answers you back. But when you're outdoors, you can't dialogue with a very, very large crowd. It won't work. And your hand gestures must be much larger so people can see them. Your facial expressions have to be exaggerated almost. Your speech rate should be slower, which is difficult for me, and your sermon should be shorter. Much of the sermon must be geared toward the altar call, and experts here who do this often prepare the congregation by saying, I'm preaching the sermon now, and in the middle of the sermon they will say, in a few moments I'm going to ask you to make a commitment. And then a second time they'll say, in just a minute I'm going to ask you to walk forward and talk to a counselor. And then a few more minutes they say, okay, now is the time for the invitation. So they're not surprising the people. They've kind of warned them a couple of times, I'm going to ask you to do this. I'm going to give you a chance to respond. In terms of music, this is another area where the host leaders understand much better what will work than the short-term visitors. In fact, I believe that most of the music should be done by the host musicians if they have the needed talent and equipment. Most of the music should be in the host language. In the day that we live, in this internet era, English has become almost universal in the world, and English music, American music, is everywhere, and some of the music could be in English. Certainly a musician who comes internationally would be a great draw, even if they only sang a few special numbers. At an evangelistic rally, the music can be more about special music with a little bit of congregational singing. If you have a public gathering of people who are not yet believers, we would not want to ask them to sing a great deal. We would not want to ask them to sing songs that are intimate love songs to Jesus. These are great songs for us, for believers to sing in a worship setting, but in an evangelistic setting, these people don't know Jesus. To ask them to sing, "My Jesus, I love thee, I know thou art mine," might not be a good idea because they're not singing the truth. Let the choir sing that song, and let the people sing a song, something like Psalm 118:24, "This is the day the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in that." Anyone can sing that kind of song. So guests on the platform, music, let's talk about locations. I think a large church building is a great place to hold a special event. You can also meet in a rented auditorium. You can meet in a stadium. But if you meet in a church, it has an obvious advantage. The people who came and who liked the message on Wednesday night or Thursday night or Friday night can return on Sunday, and there will be a worship service there. If you meet in a stadium and the people come back Sunday, there will be a football game on Sunday. Also, if you meet outdoors, you have to think about the weather. I have been a part of more than one meeting that was planned at a stadium outdoors and ended up being a disaster because rain and storm and lightning came. On the other hand, people will come to a rally at a public site, a place that's used all the time in that city or that culture for various kinds of events, who might not come to an evangelical church building. So this again is something the host needs to think about and decide, not the visitors. Let's plan to follow up. Counselors at the event are a must. If people do make a commitment to follow Christ, it's important that right then, right there on the spot, they are briefed and talked with and assisted by somebody to carry out a prayer of salvation. Nothing would be worse than to tell people what to do and then not lead them in how to do that and leave them wanting to do it but not able to do it. Plus, I love to obtain contact information, maybe on a little card. In America, we're filling out cards all the time when we go places. Maybe not in all cultures, but if you don't know who the people are who came and accepted Christ, it's going to make the follow-up very difficult to be able to go and visit them and invite them to church, to pray with them, to read the Bible with them. There's got to be some way in your culture you can obtain the contact information, if nothing else, just a home address. But more and more, you can get the email of a person, and then you can contact them via email and have all kinds of follow-up over email. The key to everything when you're holding an event is this. Rallies work when the believers bring their friends. Lost people rarely come on their own. Personal invitations are everything. The key to success is to get the lost people to come to the evangelistic rally. No matter how many posters you have up, no matter how many flyers you hand out, no matter how many newspaper articles you have and radio publicity, those things will bring a few people. Those things will make a lot more people aware of the meeting and be responsive if a believer says, hey, I'm part of the church that's sponsoring the big event in the stadium. Our family would like your family to come with us. In my culture, we even say, we will drive our car to your house and pick you up and take you with us. Now, let me explain to you, people really like to go to an event like that as guests. They have a host. And you, as the host, become the interpreter for them. When they ask the question, why are we singing this song? Or are we supposed to stand or sit? Or at the offering, you can say, this offering is not for you. This offering is for the people who are the believers putting this together. If perchance the Lord's Supper was served, the people might ask you, should we take this or should we not take this? And you'd have an answer. Even simple questions like, where is the bathroom? Or who is the person speaking? Or when is this going to be open? Most people would much rather go to an event with a host and an interpreter, a guide, if you will, than just simply show up on their own. So the successful meetings that I have been a part of involve great efforts to get the believers to bring their friends. And this was much a part of the preparation. Do you remember we talked about Operation Andrew, where we passed out cards in church and asked our believers to simply list the names of people they know that they would be willing to pray for, that these people would come to Christ? Well, if you plan a big event, do Operation Andrew a couple of months before the event. The people have prayed for a couple of months. Now say to the people, those people on your Operation Andrew list, go to their homes, talk to them, invite them to the big rally, to the big campaign, the big event. Tell them you'll come and walk with them and take them there. That's who is going to come to the event, and that's who you're going to be able to follow up with, and that's who will make your event very successful. I'll pray for you as you plan events, because events really do work, and people really can be brought to Christ. And in our next lesson, we'll talk about people who have been brought to Christ, not so much in follow-up. We'll talk about the assurance they have and the security that they have as believers. The topic, the security of the believers, is a great theological topic for all people to understand who want to be doing evangelistic work. Until then, amen, amen. I look forward to seeing you soon.